How's it going everybody, Rival Rye here and welcome back to the channel. Now, each and every year a new Pokemon anniversary or milestone reminds me of how old I'm getting. This year however, there's quite a special one coming up. 2024 marks the 25th anniversary of Pokemon Gold and Silver, as well as the 15th anniversary of its remakes. For myself, this is a particularly special one because Gold and Silver and Generation 2 in general is the one that I remember the most growing up. Now, I certainly played the originals around the same time, and I feel by Generation 3 I got a good grasp of what Pokemon actually was, but as a young child these games left a very big impression on me, and they're definitely one of the big reasons why I'm making Pokemon videos on YouTube. So in essence you can blame Generation 2 for my terrible videos. When you look back on old Pokemon games you will often find there's a lot, and I do mean a lot, of revisionism that takes place when it comes to the old games of the past. More often than not nowadays a release will be disliked on release and receive some heavy criticisms. We've heard many different kinds, such as too much water, no access to old Pokemon straight away, or games being too easy. Now, I definitely say in the last few releases the criticisms have heightened compared to previous releases, and certainly to a degree I'd say rightfully so, but the one generation that I feel has managed to avoid a lot of criticism upon release was Generation 2. I'd actually argue 25 years on, Gold and Silver as well as its remakes are the closest to being the most liked in the entire franchise, and for some certainly represent a peak in the series. Well, considering it's 25 years on, I think it's time to look back on the second generation of Pokemon and see how it holds up. And to do that, let's look back at the development of the game, and by Pokemon game release standards, a very long development time. With work beginning not long after the original games were released in Japan, Gold and Silver clocked a development time of 3.5 years. Unlike nowadays where Pokemon has sold so much it may as well have its own printing machine, back then the teams that worked on Pokemon were very small. In particular, there was a grand total of 4 people working on Gold and Silver, including the future president of Nintendo. As Pokemon took off not just in Japan but also gained enough traction to get a Western release, Gold and Silver ran into multiple issues, some expected and some unexpected. The unexpected issue was the lengthy translation period from Japanese to English, which resulted in Red and Blue being entirely recoded because of the fragile source coding. This resulted in the games being based more on the Japanese Blue version than the Red and Green encoding, hence we eventually got Red and Blue in the West instead of Red and Green. Not only did Red and Blue have to be recoded, but Pokemon Stadium was also in development at the time, again taking up a considerable amount of effort. So instead of the intended 1998 release, Gold and Silver would end up hitting the market in November 1999, and the 1998 slot was instead taken up by Pokemon Yellow, a modified version of Red, Blue and Green that tied in with the first movie, and had you used Pikachu as your starter as you lived out your fantasy of being Ash Ketchum. Now, an important thought process in the development of Pokemon Gold and Silver was the idea that these would be the final games for Pokemon and a conclusion for the franchise. Bear in mind, Pokemon started life as an idea in 1990 that was met with some serious skepticism amongst Nintendo, who found it difficult to see the appeal, and we were now in a position where Pokemon was going to get a second generation, so absolutely no expense was going to be paid for it. And the first ambitious decision that was made was the decision to not just have a new region that they were working on, but also the original region of Kanto, which was located just next door to it. Instead of travelling your standard route by defeating 8 gyms, how about you do 16 instead? This is something that has not been repeated by Game Freak in the 28 years of Pokemon. Very ambitious plans, however it did come at a slight cost. Not only did development time take longer, but by having both regions on the cartridges, the memory space of them shot up. In fact, it was doubled, and this led to some things being removed or cut due to space or time constraints, with the most prominent exclusion being the Kanto Safari Zone. The 8 new gyms consisted of Flying, Bug, Normal, Ghost, Fighting, Steel, Ice and Dragon. There was originally a cut gym that was expected to be located in the Lake of Rage, though this did not make it into the game. The old gyms returning meant the previous leaders were back minus 2 of them. Koga was now on the Elite 4, and so the Poison type gym was taken over by Koga's daughter. And Giovanni left after Generation 1, leaving both the gym and Team Rocket behind, so we also had a vacant spot in Viridian. Arriving in Kanto via the SS Anne meant the first gym leader that you would face is Lieutenant Surge, before taking on the rest rest of the leaders. Though, like in previous, you could only take on the Viridian Sea gym leader after obtaining the 7 Kanto badges. Something of note with the Kanto gym leaders is not only the inclusion of Johto Pokemon on their teams, but the fact that they have relatively low levels compared to the Viridian Sea gym leader and the final boss of the game. Lance, who is now the champion, has a highest level of 50 for his Pokemon, which is the lowest of any champion in the series. That being said, Lance has obtained his team through Game Sharks, as he has 3 Pokemon at levels they shouldn't be at yet, some of which know moves they shouldn't. I'd actually say this fits the region pretty well, as multiple trainers have Pokemon they shouldn't at levels they do, such as Slowbros or level 15 Gyarados. So it's just a generation of Game Shark users really. Now the reason that we're given for this is that there's an expectation that you would go over straight to Kanto after beating the champion, but I'm just spitballing here as my own personal opinion, but I think because Lance used to be an Elite 4 member for Kanto, the gym leaders all of a sudden having stronger Pokemon than the champion would make him seem weak. Especially with someone like Misty who could teach her Pokemon Ice Beam, and if you add an additional Surf in there, she could essentially one-shot his entire team. It's definitely still a weird situation and definitely a downside to the 2 regions, however. That being said, when you put so much into one game, you will naturally have some oversights, hence making a 2-region game has never been done again. Pokemon did also note this mistake in the remakes, and gave gym leaders much stronger Pokemon for you to battle, so it didn't feel like a downgrade. Now I actually think the best part about having 2 regions within the game was not just the fact you can have 16 gyms, but also the addition of your former rival and the former player you once were. As we mentioned, Giovanni has abandoned his post as both the Viridian City gym leader and Team Rocket's leader, so the former role is now taken by Blue in Generation 2. Sadly, you can't transfer names over, so if you gave it a silly name or like myself called it Frieza because you're a big Dragon Ball Z fan, that sadly won't translate over, but it's a fantastic tie into the original games in some capacity and a great nod to the players. He's also technically the only gym leader that doesn't specify a type either. He has the old team from Generation 1, but instead of having a starter on his team, this is replaced by the type difference Pokemon. So Arcanine for Charizard, Gyarados for Blastoise, and Exeggutor for Venusaur. Once you beat Blue, it's time to head to Mount Silver in order to face your former self, on a technicality making you both the protagonist and the final boss. So essentially you're the final villain. Red runs with Pokemon's star mascot, the stars from Generation 1, Snorlax, and an Espeon, which at the time I didn't really understand when I was younger. In the Adventures manga I know Red has an Espeon, but I actually don't know the answer to this, so according to Google this is because Eevee was a rare Pokemon to obtain in the originals, and it was the show time had passed since the original apparently. I mean, Google's always right? Anyways, the entire story of Generation 2 is pretty linear with some similarities to Generation 1. We weren't at a stage yet where we were exploring a distorted world, or having philosophical debates about owning Pokemon while riding Ferris wheels, or some area called Area Zero. Instead, we got our first Pokemon, Pokédex, decided to tackle the gym leaders on suggestion, and ultimately become the Pokemon champion. Along the way, we encountered Team Rocket multiple times, who, unlike the representation they had in Generation 1, however, were instead still reeling from losing their leader and were attempting to restore themselves to their former glory, aiming to do this by bringing Giovanni back into the fold, and ultimately becoming the force they once were. The rival is also a bit different from the original in Generation 1. Instead of being your neighbour, he's instead an outsider who actually steals his first Pokemon instead of being given it. His general mindset is seeing Pokemon as tools, being incredibly antagonistic, though he does show an intense dislike for Team Rocket, a plot point that would eventually be explored and explained in the remakes, adding a nice additional layer to his character. Whilst Generation 1 has the player's rival reach the champion rank and lose it straight away in crushing fashion, your rival's story this time is one of almost redemption, and is about changing the error of his ways. After stealing Pokemon and treating them by tools at the start of the game, by the end of it his mindset has changed, with the highlight of this being the evolution of his Golbat into Crobat in his rematches, an evolution that requires high friendship. After you take down a Team Rocket team that eventually disbands for good, you defeat the Pokemon League, and then gain access to Kanto. Once you wipe through their gym leaders and take them down, you can then have an ultimate showdown with Red at the top of Mount Silver. Generation 2's story is incredibly fast paced, and is nowhere near as intricate as some of the future titles I've already mentioned. But considering the time it was released in, and at the time you didn't really need an intricate story point, I'd say it does pretty well. Sure, as time goes on, it's important to do something different and stand out. You can't repeat storylines too much or keep it too basic, but when it was released we had one game to base it off. You wouldn't have known what it could eventually become. Now, Generation 1 had some serious balancing issues when it came to certain Pokemon, and certain types specifically. As such, for Generation 2, two major changes took place to counteract that. The first of this was the special stat split. Try saying that 3 times fast. Strangely, in Generation 1, despite attack and defense being 2 separate stats, this was not the case for Special, with it being counted as one entire stat. This unfortunately led to some seriously skewed Pokemon stats that would lead to some Pokemon being much more usable than they would be in later generations. I'd say the biggest example of this was Tauros, which would have a base special stat of 70 in Generation 1, which, yeah, nowadays isn't much to shout about, but it was still a decent stat at the time, and this was to go along with the very high attack and speed stat. Bear in mind, criticals are based on speed at the time, so it had a really good potential of it. By combining that with its move pool, which included Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, and Fire Blast, which all used a special base stat, Tauros would end up being placed in the OU tier for competitive play, as it could realistically do absolutely anything you wanted and deal with many big threats in the series. Now, another key example was Chansey, which was also in the OU tier. Long before any Eviolite tactics, it had a 105 base special, which meant it was both offensively and defensively very sound. Now, when the split came into special attack and special defense, they saw a significant decrease in their offensive power. Chansey in particular dropped an astonishing 70 base in its attack. While defensively these stats are either okay or good, offensively they were near unusable compared to previous. This stat change also was affected the opposite way as well. Alakazam in particular was hit defensively by this change, making it not as viable defensively in tanking hits. Another effect of this decision was the fixing of one of the most broken moves in the generation, Amnesia. Originally it just boosted the special stat, which meant that your offense and your defense was increased exponentially by 2 stages. That's an incredibly broken move to have in any sort of competitive, but now it only affects your special defense, which is a major improvement on previous. Now, the second major change introduced was the introduction of 2 new types to the series. Now, Alakazam already saw a slight nerf in defense by the first major change, but the second major change also targeted Alakazam and specifically Psychic types in general. It's no secret that Psychic types were the most dominant type of Generation 1. Not only were the strongest ones mostly fast, so they had a high crit ratio, because the method of working out crits was very weird, but they were supposed to be weak to 2 types, Ghost and Bug types. Yeah, there was a slight issue with that one, however. Due to a major oversight, Psychic types were actually immune to Ghost types, and unfortunately for Bug types, they didn't really have any strong attacks. Generation 2 introduced the first Bug move with a base power over 50, and that was for only 1 Pokemon. So Psychic types could just completely annihilate anything they came across. So that definitely had to be tackled, and the Dark type was introduced to nullify Psychic types. Dark types were immune to any Psychic move that was used against them, as well as being super effective to Ghost types, which are also quite a strong type in Generation 1. The second type that was introduced was the Steel type, but this was actually for a different reason. Whilst Dark types specifically came in to nullify Psychic types, Steel types were introduced to be the best defensive type of the series, while also providing Fire and Fighting types with more offensive power. Whilst Fire and Fighting types could do good amounts of damage to some types, some of the types that they were weak to were quite prevalent within the meta at the time. This could really nullify their usage, especially when you consider 2 of the best fire types in the game were 4 times weak to one of the best defensive types around. But now fire types could effectively deal with the best defensive type in the game, and fire types could deal with not only the best defensive type, but also the type that was brought in to nullify the strongest type. So many types, hard to keep up sometimes. Whenever Pokemon introduced a new type, it was a key balancing act in the series. When a type becomes too strong or too weak, a new move or type is introduced as a balancing act. We've now got to a stage where a lot of these balancing issues don't exist anymore, hence we haven't had an introduction of a new type since the Fairy type in Generation 6 to deal with Dragon types. But to be fair to Pokemon, it's something they've always had the pulse on throughout the series. Another example of this is when they brought in the Steel type to be the best defensive type in the series. This put Rock types in a precarious position, so Stealth Rock was brought in to give Rock types an extra edge. Whilst they were definitely the 2 biggest changes introduced in Generation 2, we also had some major changes that are integral to the series moving forward. The introduction of time-related quests and objectives objectives was a very ambitious decision for the late 1990s. As long as the battery hadn't run dry, this added a day and night system, which meant depending on the time of day you could get a new objective, item or Pokemon. For example, every Friday in Union Cave you could get a Lapras, and this was the only place to get the Pokemon. Every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday you could compete in the bug catching contest and get frustrated when it wouldn't work for you, or you could ride the SS Ann on certain days, and depending on whether or not you were heading to Kanto from Johto or vice versa, the trainers that were available to battle on that date would differ. Back on the topic of balancing acts, another one was changing how the critical hits were worked out. See, Generation 1 used the base speed stat of a user in order to work out the likelihood of a critical hit. I don't think I need to go into a Pythagoras style explanation for this, but it essentially meant if you had a high speed Pokemon, your chances of doing massive damage by critical hits exponentially increased. Now with a working formula with the set method, that would limit some Pokemon from running rampant and give Pokemon who didn't really have much of a chance of a critical hit ratio to now get them. Pokemon breeding made its debut in Generation 2, something that would go on to be a key competitive team building feature, and luckily for Pokemon they'd already introduced Ditto, which would be the key pendulum in terms of Pokemon breeding. So instead of being Mew's clone, it went to being a clone for everything else instead. Capitalizing on the Game Boy Color feature, Gold and Silver saw the introduction of shiny Pokemon, and as such shiny hunting videos and subcultures began. Now personally I've never been a big shiny hunter. This is mostly down to the fact I don't have the patience to reset Pokemon Platinum 237,579 times just so I could get a shiny Giratina, but at the same time I see it's an appeal for everybody else. Hold items now exist in Pokemon, with a particular focus on berries to start with, though this would eventually become a big feature in relation to strategy and battling. We've not got the overpowered EVLIs just yet, the time would eventually come for that. We also had a few move type changes, including Karate Chop, Bite, Sand Attack and Gust, which would change the fighting, dark, ground and flying respectively. There was an improvement on item space within the player's bag. Generation 1 had a total of 20 items maximum space, but now we had specific sections for specific items, allowing a separation and an easier manageability of those items. Now these are all the good additions of the generation, but not every addition is a good one. Generation 2 unfortunately introduced roaming Pokemon, which quite frankly was a frustrating mechanic, especially early on in Generation 2 and especially in Generation 3, when they could just magically disappear thanks to Raw, a move that they could learn and had access to. Fabulous decision making. A total of 100 Pokemon were added to the series in Generation 2, which currently stands as the 4th lowest of any generation, and was the lowest amount added for any generation until Pokemon X and Y in Generation 6. There was quite a big focus on previous Pokemon or Pokemon that had already featured within the series in some capacity. 20% of the Pokemon introduced in Gold and Silver were related to Pokemon that were already in the games or featured in the anime. Actually, isn't that technically 21%? Because, episode 1. Anyways, 8 of them were baby Pokemon, which were pre-evolutions of older Pokemon, and 12 of them were either alternate or new evolutions of existing Pokemon. So, editor's note, unlike me, if you're able to count, you will see 13 Pokemon on screen, not 12. Despite working with numbers, my maths seems to have failed me. I know the Pokemon that's caused this is Politoed as well. Not sure how I missed it, but yeah. Final numbers are 8 baby Pokemon, 13 evolutions or alternate evolutions of Pokemon already introduced to the series in Generation 1 or the anime, and also Ho-Oh. So technically the number is 22% of Pokemon introduced in Generation 2 are related to Pokemon we already knew of in some format. And I also just want to say sorry to Politoed, I won't forget you again. In Togepi's case, it was the first time it was available in the actual game. This is quite a common trend in Pokemon. Bear in mind the first episode of the anime in 1997 featured a Pokemon that was not yet accessible in the game, as Ash would spot a certain legendary. This was a pretty good marketing strategy. They would have the Pokemon feature in the anime or other related media in order to garner new attention to games, such as Blaziken's appearance in the Johto League 2 months before Ruby and Sapphire hit the Japanese market. 2 of those alternate evolutions mentioned were 2 new evolutions. Umbreon and Espeon took advantage and showed off the new features within the game of Night and Day, with them only being able to evolve with high friendship during those times respectively. Tyranitar officially started the trend of pseudo legendaries, and is one of only 2 introduced that are not dragon type. Worth knowing that they would eventually introduce a T-Rex style dragon in the end in Tyrantrum, and this was Rock Dragon, but instead decided to go for a unique type combination of Rock and Dart with Tyranitar. The box legendary and master trios trend started with Gold and Silver, as Ho-Oh, which was known to everybody thanks to the first episode of the animated series, and also Lugia. Both will be classified as a master of trios, one introduced in this generation and one in previous. However, I think the Pokemon that garnered the most intrigue and is arguably the most interesting of backstory from the games is one that most of us will not have legally obtained until later years, and that happens to be Celebi. Now, I've never really been a fan of this term, but the mythical Pokemon tag meant the Pokemon were not accessible, but were instead the source of a lot of rumours and interest that would create schoolyard type of talk. Now, the original generation had Mew as the main source of this. Its star role in the first movie was definitely the first sighting most of us will have ever got, and of course this started the rumour mill for how you get this Pokemon. It's important to bear in mind this is pre-explosion of the internet as well. Yes, it existed and was becoming a bit more widely accessible, but not like now where you could hear a rumour, then find multiple sources to either prove or disprove that piece of information. Back then, if it was actually under the truck and you had to beat the Elite 450 times and have every Pokemon and walk in a certain way in order to get it, the only way you were going to disprove that was by doing it yourself. Now, the actual reality of it was if you wanted to get a mythical Pokemon, it was only done by distribution, usually at whatever your standard gaming store was in your country. For some it was GameStop, for myself it would have been Toys R Us or Game. You'd have to somehow convince your parents that going out of your way just so you could get a Darkrai and a special ball was important. Nowadays this is very different because of the internet, which is a more easier method of distribution, so what's the point of doing anything different? Celebi's distribution, however, was a complete botch of epic proportions. The GS ball made its debut in the anime in January 1999, or early 2000 in the West, so everybody got to see it before the release of Gold and Silver in their respective countries. Now, the GS ball art petered out in the anime, and this was in favour of having Celebi have its own movie, Pokemon Forever. But when it came down to the distribution of Celebi, Japan would get the distribution of the GS ball to access it, confirming the item that was seen in the anime was the key to the mythical Pokemon. Now, this method was a little complicated, though bear in mind this was over 20 years ago now. You would download the GS ball via the mobile system GB, which was a paid service on phones at the time. Again, over 20 years ago, so you can imagine the phones that were being used. You could then transfer the GS ball over to your game and therefore access the event in Ilex Forest, which would allow you to obtain Celebi. There's a slight issue with that, however. Mobile system GB was not released outside of Japan, which meant that this was a Japanese exclusive. Now, the reason for this was never really explained. Maybe they didn't think mobile phones were as accessible as they are now, but unfortunately, however that decision was made, it stopped the Celebi distribution for us. Now, say for whatever reason you had a Japanese cartridge that allowed access to the event, you could just transfer Celebi over to your game, right? Well, no. Weirdly enough, the games themselves had a region lock on them, so you could only communicate with games of your region. So therefore, I could only communicate with European cartridges. So Celebi was just a complete block for us. I think this botch in accessibility is one of the only we are sorry fixes in later releases. On the virtual console versions of Gold and Silver, you just had access to this event in general after defeating the champion. Personally, I've never been a fan of this method of distribution. As you can see, it's very easily botchable and can lead to people missing out on legendaries. Granted, I understand that they are scarce, but when we cancel an event because you feel that playing a flute at Mount Coronet is too complicated, but understanding Braille is fine, we really start to lose our sense of reasoning. Now, what does Gold and Silver get wrong? Well, as I've already mentioned, the story is very basic when you compare it to later generations. The plot lines in future games are more intricate, whereas Gold and Silver's focus is on the 16 gyms and beating Red at the end, with a bit of Team Rocket thrown in there for good measure. This is definitely a hindsight thing. We do have a lot of stories to compare Gold and Silver to nowadays, so it's easy to see how it's fallen behind its future counterparts. When you come at the angle that it's just a sequel to Generation 1, it's definitely better, but for a Pokemon game, the storyline is quite basic. The level scaling is also a very odd decision. To all of a sudden beat the champion and then face gym leaders that are weaker, that really isn't a challenge. But then all of a sudden you face Red and he has level 70s. That's a really weird level scaling. Now, I pointed out earlier, I think the decision was made so that Lance had more credibility because he became the champion after being an Elite 4 member of Kanto. So for Kanto trainers to be stronger than him, that isn't a good look. But even with that as a consideration, I still don't think it was the right choice. Something that Game Freak clearly agreed with when it came to the remake. I do also feel that the Pokemon specifically specifically from Johto, are very underrepresented. This is because of the heavy focus with Generation 1, which is a shame because there's a lot of good Pokemon there. But when you consider that 4 of the 8 gyms in Johto exclusively have Kanto Pokemon, and the champion doesn't even have the Dragon type that was introduced in this generation, it sometimes feels like Johto Pokemon are a bit of the sideshow. I think these flaws are important to note, but I also feel that the steps taken forward and the improvements of the games do outweigh the negatives in the end. The most impressive thing about Gold and Silver years on is not just the additions within the games, but also the timing of them. Foundations were laid for future games and generations by addressing some of the seriously broken aspects from the first generation, while also improving and making older Pokemon better. Each generation minus Generation 5, which was seen as a soft reset that had no initial access to older Pokemon, would work on improving older Pokemon via new evolutions, pre-evolutions, mega evolutions, alternate forms, and new alternate form evolutions. Pokemon showed it wasn't afraid to address the balancing issues in terms of types by adding 2 new types in one generation, bearing in mind between Generation 2 and 9 only 1 new type would debut, once again one that was also brought in to balance another type that was seen to be a bit more broken. It's also important to acknowledge, however, Gold and Silver definitely benefit heavily from being the first sequels to the originals. This isn't to diminish the accomplishments or say that the games aren't worthy, they most certainly are, but as the first sequels to Pokemon that heavily improved on mechanics, added some fantastic features that are now core elements of the series, and completely outshined the first generation, it's very hard to go wrong because the expectation, while high, isn't as high as it is now. I think because of this we don't talk about some of the flaws that exist, because there was only one game to compare it to. When Pokemon releases a generation now, you have so many entries to compare it to from previous, so flaws can be easily noticeable. Generation 9, for example, has 8 more to compare it to, so even without the issues, it instantly isn't going to be a fan favourite. Sure, compared to the later generations, is the accomplishment of Gold and Silver as impressive? Technologically, of course not, but if you have only one generation to compare it to at the time, and it is hands down better, the conclusion is very easy. Anything past this point gets heavy comparisons. When Generation 3 came out, did it have 2 regions? No, so there's a mark against it. Same with Generation 4? No, there's a mark against it. Then Generation 5 comes out and doesn't have access to all the Pokemon, so there you go, another strike. And I can go on and on and on. Generation 1 doesn't have anything that's better than Generation 2, because Generation 2 has its entire region, along with better mechanics and fixes to go along with the new area. 25 years on, I think Pokemon Gold and Silver was not only a big step in the right direction, but a great case of right time, right place, right game, right release. It sits near the peak of Pokemon, and I do not believe Pokemon will ever get all of them right at the same time, and rightfully so. Thanks for watching, guys. Now it's time to throw it over to my comments. Now it's 25 years on from Pokemon Gold and Silver, what's your biggest memory of the games? Do you think they hold up? I'm considering making this a regular feature on my channel. A few months ago I did the Scarlet and Violet 1 year later, so is there any entry you would like me to make one on in the future? Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and follow me on Twitter for more Pokemon opinions. See you guys.